Thank you for coming and being here. Part of what I was just doing, if you are just now coming in, is that I always play a song off of my Spotify playlist because I think one of the best things to start a conversation is music, right? Music genres. Because sometimes what we listen to actually binds us a lot closer together than we think. So I actually now have an epic coding playlist that has been compiled from all the places that I've visited and all the different developers who say, you have to play that while you're coding. You have to play that while you're coding. So part of my request of you guys is that regardless of what you take away, please give me a suggestion before I leave of something that I can add, and that way it can grow and grow. Nice. Well, I'm Heather, and if you're not all that familiar with .NET, I'm sorry, it's awesome. I do it all the time. But on top of that, I've kind of grown into a polyglot programmer, right? So I branched out into the Internet of Things, is what we call it now, but at the time, it was just device development. Something that was sensor-based or mobility-based. And when I discovered voice, I got really excited because it kind of meshed my two worlds together, building services and dealing with devices. I've only ever built for large companies, so because of that, I tend to want to solve big problems right away. And that's something that I've grown kind of over the years into adjusting, that sometimes you can solve small problems first to eventually get to your big one. I also do horseback archery on the side, and there's actually quite a few in and around the London area. If you're interested in horseback archery, I think you have an association here that does that in addition to jousting. So I feel like I'm right at home as soon as I landed. I was excited. And of course, I do photography as well. So basically, I am a little bit of everything, but a lot of coding. So let's get to the point, shall we? This quote right here from the CEO of Bitly really got to me. Humans can talk at 140 words per minute, but they can only type 40. And that's on average. I suppose if you might have an elderly person, they might be able to type 15, right? You can never type as fast as you can talk or think. And so with that in mind, I'm really interested in saving time and saving frustration. The whole reason that I got into coding in the first place is because I wanted to make people's life better to free them up to be more human, right? Why should we be doing these things that take us too long that could be offloaded to another process? But unfortunately, conversational interfaces have really disappointed us for a long time. Now, I don't know how many of you phone your utility companies, right? And they send you through this long voice prompt that once you get 8 to 10 layers deep, you start getting a little bit of PTSD. You're concerned that if you say the wrong thing, then you have to start all over, and then it's terrible. Well, this technology has been around for a while, but developers have not always been on board with what it means to build a conversation in code. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Because this is not on any one platform, I'm going to talk about concepts specifically, and you can apply them to your own syntax. But just a way to think and approach building for conversational interfaces. And this is absolutely interactive, so if you wish to ask questions, by all means, just make sure that you come up and grab the microphone, and I will stop. So if we consider all the capabilities that we have now, there's so many different devices that are capable of it, but more importantly are backed by a really good artificial intelligence platform that can really take a lot of the stress out of us trying to analyze. We can have a lot better natural interactions. This might fool you into thinking that I'm going to talk to you about user experience design, and you would be wrong and right. So after I started working for a digital marketing company, I realized that the big disconnect was that we had brilliant designers and experience builders, but we were still coding in the same way. So because of the way we were thinking, we would tell them no 90% of the time, when it really, all it took was an adjustment of our mindset. And that's kind of what we're going to go over today. So because I'm technical, let's start with statistics, shall we? 70% of Google Assistant requests come through natural voice, not keyboard. For those of you who have never seen this before, this is a Google Home Mini. I was very excited when they came out for Christmas, and I got myself one. And over 8 million homes have Echo devices. This is an Echo Dot, right? That was way more than they expected for last year. And that number has only risen just in the very beginning of the first quarter. I'm going to go over a little bit of use cases as well as to why you should care about this no matter what you're building. So whether you are doing this for enterprise or you're doing this for your own startup, your own side project, you should be supporting voice as a developer. It should be another input that you can plug in. Because, and I understand that I'm in Europe now, but that's a really big number to me. For it to have that many Prime members that can order things in 2 days or less, that's really huge. And that's just one ecosystem. That's just one country. And now they have spread quite a bit. They're already getting ready to promote in Japan. And that's also going to be very large, as Japan tends to embrace technology a little bit faster than the US does. Well, it's not for lack of knowing about it. There are about 12,000 skills and climbing in their marketplace, just in the Alexa store. And that's an enormous amount. You would think we would hear raving reviews about all these things. And on Google Assistant, unfortunately, there's only a 3% chance of retention. Ew, that's not very good. And some people might argue that it just wasn't a good idea. It wasn't a well thought out skill. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe. Maybe. Even on Alexa, on the Echo platform, a lot of them don't even have any customer reviews or they're 1 stars. So what is wrong here? We have had the technology probably since the late 80s. We've started spinning up servers a lot faster now to be able to handle processing quicker. So then why isn't this working? Do people not want it? How can they have sold all these devices if people don't want it? What is this about, right? Here's an example of a review that I would consider from a educated consumer. Most consumers have no idea the separation between the company that built the device and all the third-party softwares that can run on it. They just think, oh, something's wrong with my phone. They don't really separate it very well. But this gentleman did. All he really wanted to know was context and state. That's what he's asking for here. He doesn't want to have to ask the same command over, because what you're looking at here is not necessarily the fault of the designer, it's the fault of the developer, and here's why I say that. While it's true the designer may or may not have had more leverage in the room when deciding this, the developer probably said, happy path, let's go with happy path. They just have to ask it again. So this is lazy development, you know? And somebody once told me that a good developer is a lazy developer, and I don't think this is what they're talking about. I think they're talking more about, you know, thinking about how you don't have to work so much, right? But this degrades the experience for a user. And again, you're going to learn a little bit of UX, because if you don't know a little bit about it, you can't build this. Because I was part of 3 teams who tried to build this and failed until we finally kind of stepped over and learned a little bit about conversation. And then we were able to restructure all of our architecture. So why should you build for voice? Maybe you don't work at a marketing company. Maybe not. So why should you do that? Because in many aspects, just asking a question and getting an answer is the best way. If you have to navigate through 7 layers deep of an FAQ section, that's not fun. Even if you think, hey, it's all right, I built a mobile app for that. How long does it take for them to pull out their phone, scroll through, find the app, even if it's the first button on there, even if it's the first one? How long does it take you to do that versus just asking a question really quick and just getting an answer really quick? This is where you can really shine as developers. What I really love about this is that most of this is technical. Most of this they don't even see. It is pure functionality paired with voice. So this really appealed to me because I'm terrible at drawing. I'm terrible at colors. CSS is not my friend. So, you know, I was excited about the idea that I can make something that would really make people's lives better and kind of wow them without having to look on Fiverr and hire a designer. But because I wanted to do that, I had to learn a little bit about what it meant to converse with them. So let's get into the linguistic consideration aspect of trying to build for this. What I'm going to talk about specifically is a service-driven architecture. This is not something that you would be doing like an SDK. You can do that for Siri, you can do that for Katana, but we're talking about entire ecosystems that your businesses are going to want to tap into. You're going to want to be in the same space as where they order things, daily from Amazon, or where they interact all the time on Google Maps. You're going to want to be in that space because you already have all this context. You can share information. Trust me, it's much easier to do this in a service. So let's talk about natural language processing. What Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Apple have done for us is they have abstracted this concept away almost completely and offloaded it to their own AI processing, right? So for Alexa, it's backed by Lex. That is the big brain behind actually processing everything that the user is saying or whatever is being sent in text. And it's the same for each one of these platforms has their own. We have Lewis, right? IBM has their own. And so because of these, you can decide whether or not you want to reinvent that wheel, but 4 or 5 very large corporations have done a pretty good job, and I would suggest leveraging that. What I like about being in their ecosystem is that once they determine what was said, then they can hand you over an intention. They can hand you over, hey, this was triggered. They want to talk to you. And that's really what we want to get to if you do any sort of middleware. If you do anything where you just want to deal with business logic for your company or for your project, this is the space you want to be in. It's easy to develop in it. It's easy for the users to understand. There is no learning curve whatsoever because you already know how to talk and you don't have to do one of those guided click-throughs of how to use an application. They just start asking questions. What's great about this is that depending on which ecosystem you're in, maybe you can capture users asking questions that you have not planned for, which is really cool. Because normally, you're just kind of limited to that navigation that you've already preset that they can see. But instead, if they're like, well, can I do this? You can decide if you want to capture that and say no, or if you want to capture it for the future reference and say, hey, we get all this feedback from users trying to do this thing. Maybe we should build that. It's just so much more powerful, and it's easier for people to trust this piece of software that you're building. To be very specific for those who are not aware, NLP is a branch of artificial intelligence that deals with analyzing and understanding and generating all the languages that humans use naturally in order to interface with computers in both written and spoken contexts. So when I say NLP, that's what I'm referring to. There are many abbreviations that use NLP, and I wanted to be very specific about that. Luckily, for us, we don't have to think about it mostly. We have to think about it in terms of mapping. We get to think about that aspect, but we don't have to worry about analyzing any sort of audio. Which brings me to the pillars of truth. Paul Grice is a fantastic gentleman, was kind of thought in some circles as the grandfather of voice conversational just development in general when it came to how to structure things in a way that people would identify with and continue to keep the conversation going. I had to study this in order to learn how to do it myself because I was not a natural communicator. I had to figure out how to speak to people that I've never spoken to before. And what he said is that if you focus on these 4 things, you'll be successful with almost every interaction to some level, even if they're from a different country and they speak a different language. As long as you focus narrowly on these things, you'll be successful. So what does that mean? So think about the quality of something that you built. Because I work in a marketing company, it can be very tempting for people to get over-enthusiastic about the product they're trying to sell, right? Maybe it's not very truthful about what they're trying to sell. And maybe you shouldn't be selling anything when you're just talking to your users. That's a really important aspect of being trusted. If you're brief, people won't give up on you. Remember that 3%. That 3% should stick out in your head. 3% retention on an enormous platform is really bad. So how do we fix that retention rate? You don't want to bore them for 10 minutes. You want to make sure these interactions are very quick. You have to make sure it's relevant to the conversation. So try not to steer the conversation in a direction the user doesn't want it to go, and be very clear. That's more important than anything. Being verbose is wonderful when you get to read it in a book, when you have time to read it in a book. But it's almost always better to leave out as many words as possible without being wooden. And this sounds like kind of a lot to take in, and maybe it's abstract, but you kind of know good interactions when you see them, right? I, for the first time, got to go on your metro system, the tube, right? And I always, it just kind of stuck in my head, the whole mind the gap thing. He didn't say anything else, just, by the way, don't die and fall, down into the shaft. That'd be good. But that was all that was needed. I already knew I wanted to go out, so it didn't say, hey, in order to exit, go by the doors and then step over, the gap and then go down the corridor. None of that was said. It was just mind the gap, because obviously you're probably trying to get from here to there. So there's a little bit of assumption and context and state that's taken into consideration there, right? So just keep that in mind, and you'll have very, very successful skills. Which brings me to the cooperative principle. How many people have heard of this in the audience? Anybody? Yes, a fresh audience. I love it. All right, here's a good example of a happy path flow versus a cooperative path flow. And we'll just go through it really quickly. So if your user asks to set an alarm and you just verify, what time they want that alarm for, then all you have to do is verify and say, yes, I've got it. Being cooperative means, what if the user was in the process of putting their shoes on or what have you, and they kind of forgot to answer parts of the question, or maybe they started to. So think about your methods. Did you build a method that specifically, has parameters of day and time? So that's 2 parameters, right? What if they only give you Tuesday? What are you going to do? Say, sorry, you have to give me the date and the time. That is what currently happens. This is what should be happening. You should say, what time do you want it for? Tuesday. Okay, got that. So that means you're acknowledging that you actually listened and got the first piece of information, even though it's not everything that you wanted, and then just the additional piece. And by sending that confirmation with all the pieces, it showed that you were listening to the user. You were retaining what they said. This is how you mitigate the problems that we have when we call our utility companies, right? I get so anxious when I'm getting so deep and then I screw up and then I have to start over. And that's when the users start being trained to be wary of the whole process. So this allows them to just kind of relax and give pieces of information as they can. That means that the way you structure your code kind of changes, doesn't it? You might say, oh, it doesn't change that much. But I promise you, pull up your most recent program. Have you handled this situation? Maybe, if you had really good architectural thought process, but you should be doing this all the time. This just allows it to be naturally modular and naturally conversational and cooperative. Yeah, try not to answer a question with another question. This sounds like, all these things sound really obvious, but when we sit down, we're more concerned about our performance, or we're more concerned about how beautiful or dry our code is, and so we tend to not think about this part. And in reality, because this aspect of voice is so new, using it in this way, developers are heavily relied upon to give their opinion. So you're going to be sitting in these meetings, and they're like, well, what do we do next? What do we say next? It's kind of up to you to start owning a little bit of the voice conversation process, because you have to build it, right? So start having an opinion about this. There's just no hierarchy to this entire thing. That's another way to think about it. You might have state, you might have some context, but they should be able to enter and exit any point in your skill and have it work flawlessly. And that sounds just overwhelming to me as a developer, because I'm like, no, no, no. Here's the front door, you come through the front door, and that's all you get to do. But in reality, when somebody comes up to your house, they have to find the front door. So maybe they might peer in the side window, they wonder how to even get started. And that is very, very common. So because of that, you have to think about what questions could they ask and what should we say. That's pretty much all it is. Think about it much more like an assistant. So for those of you who like Marvel comics, think about it like Jarvis. Like Jarvis will just answer the question that he's been given, but he's also mindful, right? That AI is mindful of the time. Oh, by the way, you do have an appointment you're late for now. Oh, do you want the same shirts you had last time? Actually, I just decided, here's the shirts that you always get. If you want something different, let me know. So those are things that can really delight your user, right? This is an example of what I mean by enter from many doors, right? So we have a function called order ride intent. Let's say that I'm Uber and I want to order a car, right? So I could say it in a variety of ways. I could say, I'd like to order a taxi. Or, please, can you book me a ride? Currently, this is not what happens in our applications. Part of the power of being able to leverage one of these platforms is that they allow you to map that relationship. So when should you learn this? Well, based on all these metrics and how many devices are in circulation, that's actually low. That's what it's supposed to be at the end of 2017. But just 2 weeks ago, it's already at 38 million. That's pretty crazy, just from Christmas. That's pretty crazy. So, it depends on who you are. That isn't a billion in front of that, but it's going to be changing. It's going to be doubling itself every year by 2020. So it's coming. And when I say it's coming, it's already here for lots of countries, yours included. It's just something that you should just start being able to support. Learn it right now. So what are your opportunities? What can you do with this? What does it look like for you? I got some use cases up here that are very successful. So I'm going to go through a couple just to give you an idea. And you guys have Domino's Pizza here, yes? Little guys on the bikes, that deliver pizza, yes. So Domino's Pizza decided to go all in with technology several years ago and just try everything, kind of throw darts at a dartboard and see what sticks. Well, this one really stuck for them because their users already made a profile a long time ago, on their website or in their ecosystem. And most of their users tend to like the same kinds of pizza. Who would have thought, right? So because they already had all their preferences, they actually were sitting down watching Game of Thrones with the developer saying, it'd be great if I could just tell Alexa to order me, get my regular and not have to answer any other questions. And he's like, I can make that happen. So that's what happened, is that they made it it's like a two-step process. You say, hey, Alexa, ask Domino's to order me my regular pizza. And they said, great. It'll be there in 20 minutes. And that's the whole process. Because they already saved all your payment information from before. They already had your name. They already know where you live. It's in your home. That was it. You would think, oh, that doesn't really work. They took over an additional 4% of the entire pizza market share in the world in Q4 of 2017 with that. Because all they had to do was introduce a better convenience. Because it was faster than calling, it was faster than going to the website, faster than using the mobile app. So what I'm starting to learn is that maybe setup is not the right place for voice, not the initial input, but if you're doing anything with repetition, if you're doing anything frequently, voice can really shine for you. American Express is interesting. So they had kind of like an information monitor that they wanted to do, like, how was my credit card, when it was last used, all those things, what is my balance? It's funny because Wired actually put out an article talking about worrying about the security of having a device in your home that would answer questions. I don't want people to know my bank balance. That sounds terrible. Several years ago, we were also told that it's not secure enough to build a mobile app for bank. But here we are. Because there's always a trade-off, right? A lot of users want the convenience of knowing, so they're willing to say, it's all right, I can set up some sort of security password or something to allow me the convenience of seeing this right on my device. And it was the same in the home. And now that user profiles are starting to get even more intelligent on these platforms, it'll recognize your voice on many of these, so you can decide whether or not you want your children to ask how much money you got left, to buy them presents for Christmas, or it could just be you, or you can set up two-factor authentication, right? So we can decide if you want to text your user a secret word to say, and then they just say it out loud, and it unlocks the feature. There's lots of ways we can do this. And American Express totally bought in, and once they bought in, a lot of other banks started as well. Campbell's Kitchens are very fun. So I think this is one example of hands-free cooking that I really liked. It's one of those, hey, all I have in here is bread and Vegemite. So Campbell's, what can I do with that? They're like, actually, I can send things via Amazon Prime to you, to make soup that would go really well with that sandwich, right? Or I can tell you how to make step-by-step your Vegemite sandwich. What would you like? They said, oh, tell me step by step. But my hands are full now. I have all this stuff all over. I spill it. And then I say, hey, Campbell's, give me the next step. And there was already state retention, because after 4 to 5 seconds, they stop listening. But you retained the last step, right? So all you have to do is say, hey, just tell the skill that I want to do the next thing. And that experience went over very well and also increased their bottom line. For more fun things, Anheuser-Busch is a beer company. It's a brewery in the States that's pretty well known for its big horses that pull kegs of beer, right? Well, they had noticed they had a sales problem with their Ultra 95 beer, which is basically water with a little bit of beer in it. And I know, who would drink that, right? Exactly. They're in the Midwest. We don't. We tend to drink full-bodied, nice craft beers. That seems to be the thing. But they had a lot of this, right? So one thing that they zeroed in on is the health-conscious movement that was happening in the States, right? They really wanted to get in on that. So what they ended up designing was an app that told you how many, based on how many beers you consumed and what kind they were, how many push-ups you had to do to burn the calories for it. And it sounds silly. Millions of people use this because it was hands-free. So they would just be like, okay, and 5, and they're like, oh, how many, Alexa? It's like 7. And they actually had a voice that would be like yelling at them, like, you didn't do enough. And so when they said, okay, I'm done, and they're like, would you like to do less push-ups? Ultra 95. And the sales skyrocketed, because who wants to do more work? I mean, it sounds just ridiculous, but so did Angry Birds. So I'm just pointing out that because sometimes games can work really well in this context too. Of course, obvious things like ghost stories and doing things with kids, you know, there's lots of different ways that you can do things that are not visual, right? What do you want to build? Now that I gave you examples, I'm sure you're thinking, all right, so here's some practical ones, here's some fun ones, you know, depending on where you are. There are so many that are really good. When I say so many, more than I can count on one hand. Unfortunately, apparently less than 3%, right? The major players in this, and I'm really talking about, obviously, are Amazon and Google. You know, Apple has said we're going to get into the service-driven voice AI space, but we're not there yet. So you can use our API, you can use our SDK and do things directly down on the device that they have to install. It's the same thing for Cortana. And of course, you can do service-driven Cortana work through like HoloLens or something like that, or of course your laptop. But really, we're talking about being in the home where people don't have to have their laptop or a really expensive piece of equipment in order to interact with them. I mean, this was $39 US. That's pretty low. I think this was on sale for $25 for Christmas. Now that puts it in the realm of possibility for, you know, second world, third world countries to be able to use this as well, because then it doesn't cost as much. Remember the whole Raspberry Pi thing, right? It's that if we make it inexpensive enough, more people will use it. And the more people use it, the better the connected experience that we have. Let's talk about what a flash briefing skill is, shall we? So this, of course, is very specific to Amazon's, but it actually works the same way for Google as well. So a flash briefing means let me get on a Twitter feed that is spoken, which sounds terrible, but it isn't. Because if you want to continue to keep connections with your users and to not forget you and have that retention, you need to be useful in little flashes, hence flash briefing. So this is an aggregation of all the different flash briefing skills that could be built. So the user gets to choose what they want. Most people do like NPR or, you know, the weather, but it could also be maybe the silly tweet of the day. It could be whatever you want them to know about for their meeting. It could be a little tiny thing. It's meant to be very quick, less than 10 seconds, right? Just something small. This works out very well in the gamification space. So let's say you're a radio show or YouTube show or something like that, and you want to give away something. So you tell people, if you enable, you know, our flash briefing skill every day, we'll just tell you the code that will unlock this free thing for you. But you have to listen, you know, during your flash briefing, and it gives it to you. Same thing we do on radio, right? Okay, just wait until I call in at the right moment, right? You can change this through a CMS. You can hook that all up for people and make this something that's really fun to do. But what I first got introduced to this whole ecosystem was through Alexa, turn the lights off, right? So that's called a smart home skill. What's great about smart home skills is that she doesn't talk back. Right? She doesn't talk back. She just does the thing. Isn't that nice? And so that's the idea, is that really you're just enabling, disabling some sort of remote device via the voice. This is really fun, and it doesn't have to just be your refrigerator. It doesn't have to be an oven. It can be a drone. That's what I've been doing lately, is that I plugged in my little parrot spider drones, and I say, engage, and they go like this. It's fantastic, right? So I kind of look like I'm magical or something. It's very fun. Basically, you just need a couple of things in order for that to work. It's pretty easy. So then there's the custom skill. This one can do anything you want it to, but this is the one I probably create the most often. So you kind of start off here, right? The customer asks you a question or gives you a command, and then the platform will interpret it and send it to your voice service saying, hey, this is what they probably meant by that, so go take care of it, right? So what does that even look like? They send JSON. Ta-da. It's very exciting. Something that we all know and love, right? And then we get to write JSON back and say, this is what you say now. This is what you do now. And if you can do, in addition, is a graphical representation rendered in the companion app. And it's the same way for Google Assistant. How many people here use Android in a way that they actually talk to it? Yeah? OK, cool. Siri? Yeah? OK. So you see sometimes you can see a summary of things that you've said occasionally. Depends on whether or not the developer wanted you to. That's where you would do this. So this is part of the entire message that you send back. It's not a separate thing. It's basically the same for Google. And now we'll get into the components. So how you think about this, right? Intents. So you can just think about them as events, but I use the word intent a lot. Because intent doesn't really matter which door you got in the house with. It just matters you got in the house. And you're specifically in the front room, right? The utterances are how you got into the house, right? That's the one-to-many relationship. And then there's the invocation name. So invocation name means that because these are branded ecosystems, they would really like the wake words to be the name of the ecosystem or something similar. I love that computer was enabled for Alexa. I was excited. So I can use that instead to wake up whatever device is listening, and then use an invocation name. So Domino's is the invocation name. And of course, service. So this is the big thing. This is where you're going to code. This is where you're going to code the most. And portal configuration. So if you're a front-end developer and you don't really like to do a whole lot of back-end coding, that's all right. This is also where you can spend lots of time, because you can tweak the way people say things and handle them as part of your intent. You can map different ways. I live across the hallway from somebody who is from Afghanistan. She's about 10 years old, and she loves to stop by my apartment door, which is nice and thin, and I have my Echo sitting right next to the door to tell me weather. And she says, Alexa, it's a good rain today. And it already registered her as a secondary user, right? It's pretty funny. I figured it out after looking at my logs after a while, like who in the middle of the day is talking to my device? And I actually figured out that because she has an accent, she would cut out parts of the phrase, right? And so because of that, I said, oh, you know what? I'm going to add in some additional phrases to help her out for like my custom skill. And then knocked on her door and said, I made you a voice experience. And she's like, you did? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So what it is it's a rewarding kind of bot, right? So because I already know, because her parents send me an email every so often of what her grades are, she just comes by, and based on her grade, it sends her a congratulatory kind of a thing every time. So she's like, you know, you did an A in this last week. You're going to be even better today. You'll be an A+. Things like that. It was very small, but she loved it. She thought it was great. And I spent a lot of time making sure that it understood her. And you think, well, then why am I investing in this ecosystem that's supposed to do natural language processing, right? Why would I do that? for a couple of reasons. I created a skill in English, but she doesn't speak English very well. Part of what Amazon has done lately has been creating English UK because of all of your cultural differences. You say things like cheers. What does that even mean? You know, depends on your context. And so it actually runs it through a separate process and to give you intent. This is what they are intending to mean by this, right? But until that happens for every single person with broken English from every background, you may need to help it out a little. But in general, it's pretty good. So if you're interested in any of the visual components, this can make for a very impactful experience. Kind of looks like this by default, not too bad, right? You don't really have to put lots of design into it. But this is what it kind of looks like on your phone. It just has, you know, the basic information about your application and whatever you want. It's actually considered good practice through Google to not say exactly what she said, but maybe a summary at the end of your conversation. So you can have a back and forth for a little bit and then summarize. This works really, really well for things like directions or recipe cards or anything like that. It works really well because then there's a visual reference after it if you want. It's not necessary, it's if you want. But this is probably my favorite part. So, tethered screen. How many of you guys here have worked at all with WebSockets? Yeah? Yeah, cool people. So I had this idea after watching a presentation from Nestle. They did this whole thing where they wanted to, instead of using like Chromecast, they wanted to, on these enormous screens, this display, they wanted to be able to talk to whichever assistant they wanted and have recipes chosen and given with additional visual feedback that was really big because they wanted to showcase their product, you know? And they did it through WebSockets. And I said, that would be really cool. So I took this a step further, and I did this for a very large convention called Kansas City Developer Conference in the States. There's about 2,000 people. It's a big hall, lots of echoing, perfect for testing this out, right? So I put it together where you could ask things like, okay, tell me when Jimmy Bogart is speaking, or tell me about any sessions about natural language processing or JavaScript. And because it's a keyword search for me, I would just aggregate them all together and show them on the screen. Because it's so fast to go through Amazon servers or Google servers, and it was so fast to do the WebSocket, it was at the same time every time. She answered verbally while you got additional visual feedback. She could say just little things, though. Remember, we don't want her to be really verbose. We didn't want her to read every description. We just wanted to say, there are several today, and there's one starting in like 20 minutes. Or she could say, Jimmy Bogart is speaking at this time and this time in room 2 and 4. All the really basic things you need to know, but if you wanted more details, you could see it behind it. It was very, very successful. It's something that's going to be growing quite a bit. And so I built that with Web API using SignalR for my WebSockets. It worked very well, and I built the whole thing in 48 hours. So this is not difficult to do. As I can tell you, this is a bunch of JSON. Really, you just get to spend some time making sure the conversation is right. Which brings me to what intents kind of look like. Sorry for the pixelation, but this is pretty much the structure you would get. You would say, hey, the user said something that triggers your event, your intent, okay? And then it will give you any additional data with it. So there are plenty of things that they could say that may not give you additional data. You can just say, hey, order me my last pizza. That's not something where you'd need to pass along a parameter, right? So maybe you do this with no slots at all. Slots are just placeholders for additional words that the user says that you need to know, like horoscopes. So because it's going to be dynamic, I have no idea which sign they're going to say. I don't know if they're going to tell me, I'm a Virgo, I'm a Leo, I'm a whatever. So I create a slot for that, and then I create a custom data type, which is a derivative of just the base object, right? So it can be whatever I want it to be. It's kind of nice. It's pretty simple. Or you could do this with something that isn't human. So let's say you want to talk to something through Alexa, right, that is hooked up to a robot, or hooked up to a robot maybe that's using a keyboard, hooked up to a drone, whatever have you. And it might kind of look like this. So the input type might say drone here instead. You know, depends on what you want to do. And so those slots, here's an example of that same use right here. You know, that's how you would lay out the structure of the request. The intent is usually named, and it's said in such a way that can be recalled quickly. This is any sort of evaluation that you need for the utterance, and then there's your slot. You can have a combination of slots. You can just say slots as well. That's a little trickier because it's really tough with addresses, right? There's just so many places people can live. And I really don't want to create a list, a drop-down of possible addresses everywhere in the UK. So sometimes you have to leave the slot at whatever length the user has. I think you have up to 9, but that means you have to train it. You have to train it and say, this address could be 3 words long, it could be 4 words long, it could be 5 words long. So that's training a model. How many of you guys in here have played around with machine learning at all? Yeah, that's just basic obfuscation of the machine learning algorithm that they've got. So all you're doing is doing something specifically tailored for what you've got. And I've already kind of talked to you about that one-to-many relationship. So what about expression? You know, I always thought that it kind of sounded a little wooden, you know, talking to these. It got better over time, but if you listen to, even now, some of Google's voices that you can choose from, it's pretty funny. You know, I can't wait for Eddie Izzard to be my voice, you know, like I'm ready for that. Do you have any control over this at all? Let's say this only really comes up when you are a company who has very specific ways of expressing yourself, right? Maybe the Old Spice guy or the Poopery lady or whatever it is. You want to very specifically have character and personality. Good news for you, it does exist a way to completely mesh this to your desires, right? SSML stands for Speech Synthesis Markup Language. Yeah, just like HTML and CSS, but for your voice. It's very cool. You can do everything now in addition to saying, oh, replace this with this word. You can make that dynamic. You can have her pause. You can state, I want to play a little audio file before she talks, after she talks, whatever you'd like to do. You can now control the prose. You can control the pitch. You can control if she whispers, if she yells. Now you've got a lot more controls. And if your front-end developers and designers were sad that you took away their jobs from them because we're doing voice, this is where they live now. They get to play all around with it, and it's really fun. She actually does a pretty good job on her own. Google does a pretty good job on its own as well with having a personality. But if they really want to be specific, because it's, you know, ghost tales from the crypt, you know, before Bitcoin, or whatever it is, you know, you get to play around with it, and it's a lot of fun. If you're interested in the official spec, it's been out for about 12 years. Surprise! It's been out on W3, so definitely check that out. But in addition to this, each one of the ecosystems have registered for specific additional tags just for their system. So there are little, we call them speech cons. Has anybody heard of speech cons? Nope? Okay, well, you know what emoticons are, right? You know what those are? They're emojis for your voice. So you can tell her to say things like, hooray, but it does it shorthand, and she says, hooray, just automatically, little like tiny things, you know, or, well, I never, you know, something very, you know, that has a specific cadence to it, little things, so that you don't actually have to sit there and play with every single decibel level. There are some like quick shortcuts, and they're called speech cons. Really, really fun, and it's growing all the time. If you're interested in additional references about this, we're going to talk a little bit more about intent sequencing, but FreeBusy has a great blog post on it that I highly suggest you take a look at. What's interesting about doing voice is that it is stateless. Like, Alexa has no idea about what you're talking about. It just hands things back and forth. But it does know that you started a voice session. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room. You can put variables, you can put any sort of values inside of that session, but it's up to you to save it to a database somewhere. But like while the session is alive, while the user's talking back and forth, you do have some retention if you choose to, but it's not there by default. You just go ahead and add it to the array, right? And if you want to play around with SSML more, Bespoken is fantastic. You can play with different audio levels right away. And this last one, I wonder, do I have any Trekkies in the room? Does anybody like Star Trek anymore? Is it just me? Yes, okay. So LCARS is the name of the system that runs on the computer in the Starship Enterprise, right? So that was my first introduction to the idea of just talking to a computer and it doing things for you. I thought it was so neat, and I always kind of wanted to have that experience. So the very first skill that I wrote was an LCARS example skill, where I could say things just like, Picard to the bridge, or I could say engage, and if I say that, it would play the sound of the warp engines going. It was great. Like I got to, and it would retain which starbase I told it to go to, or what stardate I was on. It was great. And over time, it would say, oh, welcome back, counselor, because Counselor Troy was the best one. So that's what she said by default, but you could also change what ranking you were. So like different kinds of things like that. I put this out on GitHub. If you want to play around, it is .NET based. But I only did that because I didn't see an example in .NET on any of their websites. And you can use their SDKs, but you don't have to. Really, at the end of the day, it's just a REST endpoint with some JSON. And I can deal with that, right? We just reverse engineered that and created something that looks like I could extend an existing project that already is doing stuff for mobile and just add an endpoint for voice, right? So I could reuse already all of the business logic I've been doing. And I did this at a local little, we have a gas station, right, in Kansas City. It's called Quick Trip. It's very fun. And I wanted to play around to see if I could order food, with the same service that I built for it to be ordered on the phone, right? We already built that. Why not extend it? Yeah, it took us a week. That's it. And that was with testing. With professional people testing it. It just didn't take us long, because now that we had a clear vision of what we wanted to do, it didn't have to sound the same or have the same kind of flow, and it didn't. But we used the same business logic, so we didn't reinvent that wheel. That's why this is really exciting to me, is that you don't have to start all over from scratch doing device development. I think this prediction is amazing, because that percentage is also incorrect now. Now it's at 32. 32% of our interactions are through conversations with smart machines. That's crazy. I love that, but it's so crazy to me. So it's definitely not a fad, especially if you think about the accessibility part of it, right? So I don't know how many of you are asked to be compliant for people with different levels of disabilities, but also just maybe different styles of learning, different styles of navigating. And this is just going to be one that all developers eventually, probably in the next couple of years, will be expected to have in your tool belt. The good news is it's not really that scary, and it's a lot of fun to play with. The biggest thing I want you to take away, though, when you structure your code, is that all the various user responses that you get are opportunities. They are not errors. They're people. They speak differently. They have different cadences, and that doesn't mean you can't service them. You have to just kind of delight them, and then they will constantly use your app again and again. I mean, it's amazing the examples of things that people like and retain are very simple. It can be simple. It should be short, but you should still delight them with what you already understood about what they said. Don't make them repeat themselves. It sucks for them just as much as it sucks for us to write in code. Try not to repeat it. It's really important that you show them that you're listening, and that's how you gain the trust of a user. So in conclusion, make sure you create cooperative conversational experiences. If nothing else, you'll walk away with that, right? Learn the market and find where you can provide value for that. If you work in the medical industry, this is huge. When you're in a place that is a small office ridden with germs, why would you have people touching and writing things down? Just say, this is what my ailment is, or this is my problem. It can be done in their own words, in the way that they say it, and it could go straight to a nurse or straight to a doctor. You don't have to worry about contaminating things. There's a lot of use for this. Make sure that you keep skills short and to the point. Just build it very specifically and focused. Don't do a big overarching skill that can do all the things that this medical company can do, or all the things. Build for a specific purpose. And start building your prototypes now. If you can do it in about 2 hours, and that's with fuddling around a little bit, you can do that in a weekend. And it's really fun to do specifically with your kids, because nothing delights them more than being able to make something happen, right? Don't just come up with a voice idea. Make sure you come up with an idea that is best suited for voice. So maybe filling out your taxes orally is not going to be fun. Like maybe allow that to be something that you do with the web application. But there's still an awful lot of places for you to grow with this. Thank you very much for coming. If you have questions, let me know. stay curious.